Hello and welcome everybody to today's Q&A live. My name is Leah. I will be your moderator for today's event. And right before we get to your questions and answers and bring our guest officially on, I wanted to give you all a heads up to go ahead and click the link for a free download in the event description for today. This is a PDF. It is called the Color Theory Download. So if you are interested in colors and mixing and matching and what you can take, little tips for how to choose the colors for your projects, go ahead and click that free PDF download for you. That will be in the event description. And I'm sure our tech team often drops some of the links into the chat box as well. So speaking of the chat box, if you haven't found it already, that's where your questions are going to be coming in from. If you have questions or comments during the entire Q&A time that we have today, you're going to drop them into that chat box. It should be below your video or on the Facebook or YouTube chat. So use that right now if you would like to say hello and where you're viewing from. And I do see that we have some questions that have already started to come in. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's expert. Today we've got Nicki with us today. Nicki, hello, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get started with the questions when you're ready to go. Floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nicki LaFoille, and I have been sewing since I was about 11 years old. So that's been like 20 some years now to age myself. But I worked for Sew News Magazine, Sew It All, the PBS TV show and the magazine, and creative machine embroidery. So I've gotten a lot of experience over the years with a lot of different types of crafting and sewing. So I've been fortunate to get a little bit here and there and get to explore. And that's my favorite thing about sewing, is to expand upon skills just by building a little bit at a time. And then, before you know it, you can make all kinds of things anything you can dream up, essentially. So it's a fun hobby to have.
All right, well, welcome, Nicki. We're really excited to have you, and we'll get to as many questions as we can with the time that we have together today. And I'm going to dig right in and get started here. We're going to go to Brenda's question first. Brenda is asking, what is the best way to put on quilt binding and get the corner perfect?
Yeah, so quilt binding, I'm not much of a quilter, but I do have some experience binding because I like to bind edges of necklines, and binding is great for finishing the edges of different like home deck things too. So the same type of rules apply. So when you're binding a quilt and you want to get that mitered corner perfect, so it's a little bit of a technique. So whether you're doing like a single fold binding or a double fold binding, you want to do kind of the same thing. So you're applying the binding along the straight edge, and you want to stop sewing your seam allowance distance from the next edge. I get this question a lot, so I have a visual aid. So let's see here. So we're sewing our binding onto this straight edge, and I stopped sewing my seam allowance distance from this edge. So this is sewn. So what you want to do is fold that binding up so that you create a 45-degree angle here, and you create a straight line here of your project and your binding. So you've got a nice 45-degree, and then you fold it back down so that you align your fold with this previous edge that you stitched. And then you can start stitching again right at that very edge and stitch down. And then I'll show you a corner that I've already done here. When you push that toward the right side or the wrong side, whichever side you started applying your binding to, you'll get that nice little miter right there. And then on the wrong side, or the right side, the other side, you want to fold that corner so that you get a nice 45-degree in that fold right there. And then you can finish your binding either by hand stitching, or you can stitch in the ditch, which will catch that fold on the opposite side. So there are different techniques for finishing depending on if you want to sit with a quilt and hand stitch that binding, because that can take some time, or you can stitch in the ditch. It'll be a little more visible. If you stitch in the ditch, you'll be able to see that seam on the other side when you catch that fold. But it all depends on what you like to do, how much time you have, and if it's going to be like a quilt for a show or a quilt that you're going to use and wash and love. It all depends on where you want to take it from there. But that's mitering corners. So once you get that technique down, it's, you can whip them out, and yeah, not too hard.
Okay, so we're going to stay on quilting for the next question. I know, Nikki, you said that this isn't your expertise, but we'll do another quilt question before we move away. And this one comes from Lou. Lou is asking, what is the best way to attach batting on a baby quilt?
So a baby quilt, that's nice because it's a little smaller than like a big queen size quilt. So to attach batting, I know the temporary spray adhesive or temporary spray based is a really popular thing for quilters to use, because you can spray it and make your quilt sandwich with your backing and your batting and your topper, and it's easy to kind of peel it off and move it around if you need to adjust. So that's good for lining things up initially. And then I know a lot of quilters like to use safety pins to really get that quilt sandwich secure for when you put it under the presser foot and you actually start quilting, so things don't shift around with that kind of puffy batting layer. So you can try it with some spray adhesive and see how that works. If you want a little extra security, if things start shifting, you can put some pins in. I've heard quilters say that you want to secure every this far, every 5 or so inches, to hold that quilt sandwich together. So putting pins in about every 5 inches, so things don't shift around. And they do make safety pins that they're not like a straight bar. They have like a angled or a curve, so that you can get it into your batting sandwich and get it secured easily. The straight safety pins, a lot of times it can be kind of tough and you're like bending the metal. So there is actually a specific for quilters safety pin that you can use that makes it easier even. So you can try those.
All right, before we move away from quilting into clothing for our next question, just a hello to all of our viewers. We've got some people watching all the way from Oregon to Florida to Texas in between. So hello to everybody, especially if you're just joining us and weren't here for the very beginning. We're going to get to as many of your questions as possible, so feel free to let us know what it is that you're wondering about with sewing with Nicki here to answer your questions. My name is Leah, and I'll be getting to as many of your questions as possible. We're going to go with Ramona's question next, and Ramona is wondering, how do you get the bust darts to fall in the right spot?
Yeah, so bust darts and like the whole bust area in tops can be kind of hard for people, because sewing patterns, they're made for like a general body, and everyone's body is different. So you might need to shift things around a little bit. And the best way to do that is to make a mock-up. And I know it seems like a lot of extra work making 2 garments instead of just making 1. But a lot of the alterations that you might need to make in the bust area are things that can't really be done after the fact, like after you cut it out in your actual fashion fabric. So cutting it out in a muslin or like an inexpensive cotton is a great way to see how all of those points are going to fit on your body, and mark where you need to alter, if you need to move the bust point up or down, in or out, and then you can transfer those from your muslin mock-up back to the pattern, so that when you cut that pattern out in your actual garment fabric, you know how it's going to fit, and you're not going to need to do a whole lot to it once it's cut out in the fabric that you want to preserve and to last and to wear and wash for a long time. So some things can be done in the pattern stage. You can measure the pattern and You should definitely start by cutting out the pattern size that most closely matches your bust measurements. That's a question I get a lot of times too, because oftentimes a pattern will, pattern size will match one measurement perfectly, but be, off in the waist or something. So definitely cut out the pattern size that most closely matches your bust measurement. And you can take some measurements and on your body and see if they match up with the pattern. And blending between pattern line sizes is a great first step, a great first alteration to do in the pattern stage before you cut anything out. And it's really easy. So if you were a size 10 in the bust measurement and a size 8 in the waist, it's really easy to simply blend between those sizes. So you can start at your size 10 line in the bust and really just curve that line in to the size 8 line down at the waist, trying to kind of mimic or mirror the curve of the pattern lines. And it's an easy way to do that alteration first, really just drawing a line on the pattern. So before you do anything to the pattern, look at that, see if you need to do that. And I always too recommend to trace a copy of the pattern so that you have it on separate pattern paper so you can preserve that original tissue paper pattern that you bought in a packet from the store, because once you cut that, it's hard to tape it back together if you want to then do something else to it. So I do a lot of pattern making and alterations, so that's the number one first thing that I always do. And I have a roll of pattern paper I just bought on Amazon. The thin type that you can see through so that you can trace on is super nice. It makes tracing off patterns super easy. Just lay it on your pattern, put some pattern weights on, trace it so that you have your original, just in case you really mess up your alterations and you need to go back to the original, because that has been known to happen. So I went on a little bit of a tangent there. I hope I answered the bust dart question and some other questions that no one knew they had.
So good luck finding the right spot for those darts then. I think that was incredibly helpful. We're going to give you a 3-parter question next here, Nicki. I'll ask it all at one time, and then we'll just piece through it together. So this one comes in from Divya, and Divya is asking, how do you choose or buy a sewing machine? What is important to look for when you're getting a new sewing machine, and what companies do you recommend? So you can work your way through that piece by piece.
Okay, so this is a really good question too, because it's very subjective, but there are some things that you want to look for and some tips for buying a new machine. So when you're looking to upgrade or to buy your first machine, you want to think about what type of sewing you want to do, because there are, general all-purpose sewing machines. There are sewing machines that are better for quilters. So if you want to do a lot of machine quilting, getting a machine that has a lot of space here is really important, because as you roll up that quilt to get that bulk through here, you want a lot of space in the arm here. If you want to do a lot of garment sewing, you want to make sure your machine has the type of buttonholes you want. And if you like to do decorative stitches, a lot of machines come with a lot of built-in decorative stitches, but you can look at those and see if it has the types of stitches you want. I do a lot of garment sewing, and honestly, all I really need is a couple buttonhole stitches, a straight stitch, a zigzag stitch. Sometimes I use a triple stretch stitch, which is nice when sewing super stretchy stuff. But really, most machines come with those stitches preloaded on them, ready to go. So you want to think about what type of sewing you do. And this machine is a FOF. So I love my FOF because it has the integrated dual feed foot on the back, which is a little black thing that comes down and hooks up under my foot, and it's like a built-in walking foot, which is great for keeping fabric layers even, which would probably be really good for quilters too with their batting sandwich. I know quilters love to use the walking foot for that purpose because it helps feed the top layer at the same rate as the feed dogs are feeding on the lower layer. So I always have that engaged whenever I can. It just helps to prevent that creeping of the fabric layers to keep everything even. So I love FOF. My first couple machines were Brother machines, and they were great for the price point. You know, I was a poor college student and buying a Brother machine for like 80 some dollars. I mean, inflation is probably a little bit more now, but still it's kind of a low overhead cost, a low investment to grow your skills and then figure out where you want to go in your sewing, whether it's embroidery or quilting or more garment sewing, and then you can upgrade from there. And machine embroidery is a whole other animal. You do need a specific embroidery machine that can read the designs and stitch them out and have the capability of hooking on a hoop to stitch out those machines. So that's a whole other thing. But to choose the machine that's right for you, think about where you want to go in your sewing. Ask people who you trust, because there's some amount of brand loyalty going on too. If someone grew up sewing on a Bernina and have always sewn on Bernina, they're going to rave about Bernina. So you can ask around, but the thing that's going to be the best is going into a dealer and actually getting your hands on a machine and getting your foot on the foot pedal of a machine and really testing out the features, see what makes sense to you intuitively. If you like a machine that's a little bit more tech, like if it has a screen here. I know Ashley Huff, she loves her machine that kind of does everything for you. She just has to press a button and it senses the fabric and everything, and it just does everything for you. I like a machine that's a little bit less smart and that I have a little bit more control. So I know exactly what's going on at all times. It's got like 10 buttons and that's it. And it's really easy for me to understand. So that's what I like, but it's all personal preference. So I know it's hard with what's going on right now. You might not be able to go into the store to actually drive a machine, but actually sitting down and getting a feel for it can be super helpful. But you can also read reviews on whatever website you're shopping on, Amazon or some other dealer websites. You can read reviews from people who say what they like about it, what they don't like about it, and that can really help you make your decision. So if you have bought a machine online, it's really helpful to write a review. It's helpful to other people. So I definitely encourage writing reviews, and that just helps, share the knowledge in the sewing community as to, what features on new machines are great and maybe what might not be working as well. So driving it, reading reviews is a good way to really get a feel for it too.
All right, hopefully that's helpful for any of you out there that are thinking about buying your first sewing machine or maybe doing an upgrade. We're going into fabric with our next question here, and this one's from Kayla. Kayla would like you to please explain bias fabric. Why does it need more fabric per pattern? I have some, but I don't know what to make with it or how to work with it.
So bias is a grain line. So in your fabric, you've got the lengthwise grain and the crosswise grain that are at a right angle to each other. And then the bias grain just means you're matching up the grain line on this diagonal. So like a 45-degree diagonal is your bias grain line. It's a little bit more stretchy than your lengthwise or crosswise grain. That's fairly stable. But your bias, because the threads of the fabric, so lengthwise, crosswise, because the bias hits it at an angle, it allows it to stretch a little bit. So it cutting garments on the bias, there's a really nice drape to it. The fabric kind of hugs over your body. It's really comfortable to wear. It can be tricky sometimes to sew because the bias grain line does stretch a little bit more, so you have to be careful that things don't twist out of shape. But you need more fabric for patterns that are cut on the bias because it's really easy to line up your pattern pieces straight on the straight grain and get them all, nice in a row. But when you're lining the pieces out on the bias, you don't get as much, you can't fit pattern pieces into a tiny corner of your yardage. It kind of lays across. Your pattern pieces don't fit as nicely when things are cut on the bias grain. So you just need more fabric to work with so that you can lay out all of your pattern pieces. So that's why you would need more fabric. And good luck with that bias pattern. I think the garment will turn out beautifully. You just need to take time. You take your time with it.
All right, another detail that we'll find, another vocabulary word in patterns, Jasmine has a question about. Jasmine is asking, what does nap mean when you find it on a pattern?
So nap, a lot of times patterns will say if your fabric has a nap, you also need a little bit more fabric because you want the nap to be running in the same direction for all of your pattern pieces. So you can't do like one going this way and flip and do one going that way. They all want to go in the same direction because a nap so velvet has a nap. Flannel will sometimes have a little bit of a nap, but velvet and velveteen is more what you think of when you think of fabrics with a nap. Fur fabrics are technically a nap. It's when you have, your little floofies coming out of the flat part of the fabric. So it's little threads that are sticking up from the fabric. That's a nap. And that nap kind of catches the light differently. If you've ever run your hand up a velvet garment, you can see how it changes the look of it. It changes the way it catches the light. So if you had one, say you were making a blazer, if you had one side of the blazer with the nap running down and one with the nap running up, it would look like two different colors because it would catch the light differently. That's a nap. It's the things that stick up from a fabric, velvet, velveteen, fur, that kind of thing.
Okay, let's move to Amanda's question next. Amanda, this is a question near and dear to my heart, so I can't wait to hear Nicki answer this one. Amanda has low-rise jeans and wants to make them high-rise. How would she do that?
Okay, so if you want to extend the rise of your jeans, so if it's a pair of jeans that are already like a ready-to-wear pair of jeans that you want to alter, you could cut off the waistband and add a little panel. It could be like a matching denim, so it wouldn't be real noticeable, or you could go contrasting fabric, so it would be like a little design detail. And you can add that little panel in under the waistband and stitch it, to the bottom of the waistband and then to the top of where you cut the waistband off and get a little bit more rise in your jeans. But the waistband is kind of where your jeans start to come up and do this thing. So you'll want to be careful. You may need to sew a dart or two into that little panel. You may also need to change out the zipper because if you're adding some in between, the waistband and the top of the zipper, you're going to need to figure out how that is all going to fit in together. But you can do it so that you're adding more in the back and taper it down in the front. So it's tapering down to a point at the fly of the jeans, so you don't have to mess with the zipper, but you wouldn't be getting a whole lot in the rise in the front, just in the back. But that can be helpful too. But if you're at the pattern stage and you want a higher rise, it's really easy to do at the pattern stage. Honestly, you can just cut off the waistband. So if the waistband is a separate piece, is a separate pattern piece from your pants, you can just add some length to the top of the pants. Or if the waistband is part of the pattern, you might need to slash it and add some paper in under those pattern pieces and tape it all together. And then when you cut it out, you'll have a higher rise. So doing it from the pattern stage is super easy, and it's that's why you really want to look at your patterns and see what changes you want to make there first before you get the garment half completed or completed and then have to make changes to it. But altering the garment, it can always be done as well.
Right. Good luck. I know lower rise are back in the stores, and I'm a high rise fan myself. Okay, Mary Beth has our next question. Mary Beth is asking, do pinking shears really stop fraying? The fabrics that I love are always easy to fray, so I turn myself away from them.
Yes, pinking shears are awesome, and they really do stop fraying or at least cut down on it a lot. So like with a rayon fabric that if you just look at it, it starts fraying, your pinking shears are really, really going to help. And it's not going to maybe stop it altogether, but the pinking shears are, I don't have them right now, but it's the scissors that you cut and it makes like a little triangle cut. And that it stops so that instead of having just like, you know, your straight grain and see this is fraying because it's straight and they'll all pull out. When you get those triangle cuts, some little tiny threads might come out, but then it stops the fraying right there. So it is super helpful for that. And when I go to finish my seam allowances on the inside of a garment, a lot of times pinking shears are all I will use. Is just cut the edge with pinking shears and call it a day. If it's rayon fabric, I might want to throw a straight line of stitching in like a 1/4 inch away from my raw edge on my seam allowances and then go in with the pinking shears. But it's still a really, really easy way to finish off your seam allowances. And yep, that's what I did on my shirt that I'm wearing right now, because I made this one is just pinking shears. And so I highly recommend having a pair of pinking shears in your sewing drawer.
And if you have any little ones around, don't let them do what my brother and I did and use them to cut paper.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely did that to my grandmother as children, and we learned those are not arts and crafts. All right, let's go to Janet next. Janet has a comment, and I'd like to see what your thoughts are on this, Nicki. So Janet loves to find shortcuts in sewing, and I love finished inside seams. So I find it easier to do French seams rather than zigzagging unfinished seams. So what are your thoughts on that, Nicki?
Yeah, French seams are fantastic. They're beautiful, and it's a really nice way to finish off the seam allowances on the inside of a garment. So everything is encased. It looks super, super nice, and it gives it's such a simple technique, but it gives like a couture finish almost to garments because you just don't see that a lot in garments. And the French seam, for anybody who doesn't know, is when you sew your seam allowances with the wrong sides together first. Normally in sewing, we always go right sides together so that our seam is on the inside. But with a French seam, you're sewing your seam with wrong sides together, and you sew it at about half the distance of your seam allowance. Flip everything so that the right sides are together, and then sew again with the rest of your seam allowance. And it's important to trim that first seam allowance down a little bit so that when you flip it and sew it again, you don't get little bits of thread sticking out of your seam. So trim that first seam down to like a 1/4 or like 1/8 of an inch probably, and then sew the rest of your seam allowance. So the raw edges of that seam allowance are encased kind of in that seam, and you don't see them at all. So it's super nice and pretty, and it makes for a really strong seam as well because you're essentially sewing it twice. But it's beautiful, and The lapped seam is a really nice one too for encasing your seam allowances and making a really nice seam. So the lapped seam is on the outside seam of your jeans. That's what you see a lot. And they do that in denim jeans because it is a really strong seam. So the lapped seam is when you sew either with right or wrong sides together, trim one side of the seam allowance down, and the other side you fold the raw edge down back and then fold it over the side of the seam allowance that you trimmed, and then stitch that folded edge down. So again, you're stitching that twice, kind of, and it encases both both raw edges, and it looks really cool. And that second seam line you do along that folded edge is kind of like a cool decorative stitch in a way. So if you have the time to do that kind of seam finish, it can be super cool. It can add a little decorative touch to and make your garments last longer through washing and wearing. You can just extend the life of your garment. So I think that's fantastic that Janet likes to do those French seams.
Well, a lot of your answer does seem to almost half answer Jasmine's question. So I'm going to skip to this one next. Jasmine says, I've been sewing my own garments for a bit, but nothing ever looks super polished. So are there any tips that you can give me to make my garments look like I bought them?
Yes. So yeah, there are times when you make something and someone says, "Oh, you made that, didn't you?" And it's like, "Well, darn." You're going for the look of something that was like professionally made, like super duper professional. So there are some things that you can do to make things look a little more polished and a little more professionally made. And a lot of it is just really subtle things like in the details. So, first of all, using your iron, pressing your seams, pressing your hems to make them look super crisp is super helpful. Another thing is using a twin needle on your hems is just a little subtle thing, but because most ready-made garments have that double needle hem on the bottom, if you have not used a twin needle before, the one in the middle there, so that's the twin needle. So with the red bar, it's got two needles. It's actually very easy to use once you learn how to thread that second needle, and it can give a little just professional detail on the hems of your sleeves and your bottom hems. So the double needle stitch is great. Any sort of decorative top stitching, I think, adds a little professional look. So anywhere you have a seam, like I have, little panels in my shoulder seam here, just adding a little line of decorative stitching next to the seam just adds a little bit of pop, a little bit of something, which I think makes things look very professional. And if you're making purses or bags, hardware is a really great way to take it up a notch and make it look like it came straight from the store. And it can be just little things like little buckles, a magnetic snap. I have a class on nationalsewingcircle.com about making a backpack and all types of different hardware that you can add either to a backpack or to a purse, swivel clasps, just like a little metal rectangle to attach your strap rather than stitching the strap right to the bag. Make a tab, add a little metal rectangle or a D-ring, and attach your strap to that. And just that little detail, honestly, can make something look really polished. So just those little things I find make a huge difference.
All right, and before we leave this little umbrella topic altogether, I have a follow-up question here from Linda. Linda is asking, is the lapped seam that you mentioned, Nikki, also what I call a flat fell seam?
Yes. Yes, the flat felled, yes, I think it is. I may have been using the wrong term. I may have been calling the flat felled the lapped, but flat felled is the technical term for what I was describing. So yes, good catch.
Perfect. Great ask, Linda. Okay, let's go back to machines for a moment with Janet's question. Janet is asking, Nikki, what is the best machine for leather?
So for sewing leather, I have sewn faux leather on my FOF Passport 2.0 and like multiple layers of faux leather when you're making a strap and you're folding it. You have like 6 layers of faux leather, and my Passport 2.0 here could chew through that no problem, um, as long as I have a leather needle on the machine. So if you want to do like real leather and thick leather, so leather comes in different thicknesses. So if you're using like super thick leather, you might need a heavy duty machine, and those are different than general home sewing machines. I've never sewn on a real like heavy duty machine before, so I can't speak to that too much, but I know these home sewing machines, if you have a leather needle on, a lot of them are super powerful. So it depends on what type of projects you're wanting to do, what kind of leather you're working with. But the leather needle has like a chisel tip kind of, so it can really punch through a lot of layers of thick leather. So make sure you have one of those and give it a shot on whatever machine you have. So yeah, you'd have to do a little bit more research on a heavy duty machine for leather, but yeah, in my experience, my machine has done everything that I've needed it to do, but I've been using faux leather, so it might be different.
All right, well, good luck with trying all of those little tips out for leather the next time you're at it. Carrie's got a question here about dress forms. So Carrie does not have a dress form, and it's really difficult to create patterns for my own body, she says. Do you have any tips for that, Nikki?
So I don't have a dress form either. I know you can make a dress form from your own person with like duct tape and padding. I don't know if there's a video on National Sewing Circle for that, but I've seen it on, I don't know, YouTube or Pinterest or something, but never tried it, but that's an option. But for me, I do make a lot of garments, and I have never seen the need for a dress form. If you want to do a lot of draping, a dress form is quite necessary for that. But I don't do a lot of that. I just use, the flat pattern. Um, but I just looking at the pattern, taking your time at the pattern stage, paying attention to your measurements and the measurements of the pattern. And like I was talking about earlier, making a mock up of the pattern in a muslin or an inexpensive cotton is super helpful for shifting lines around and doing whatever needs to be done to alter to fit your body. But you can put in a lot of work to make yourself a sloper first. So you can, I know there's a Craftsy class about it. I think Susie Fur does the class, and it's how to take your own measurements, draw your own basic block pattern, and then from that pattern that fits you perfectly, then you can make any other pattern you want from that basic building block, design details slash, do different whatever you want to do to it. When you sew it all together, it's going to fit you well because it's from that basic block that you made, that you took all of your own measurements and drew that pattern to fit you specifically. So if you like pattern making, that could be a good route to go on because, if you have that basic building block, it makes everything else easier, but you just have to put in the work to make that basic building block fit you to a T first before taking it off to do other things with it. But there are, like I said, Craftsy classes about making a sloper. I think on National Sewing Circle, there are a lot of pattern alteration videos as well. So that could be a route to go on.
Okay, we're going to go into fabrics with our next couple questions here. And also, before I ask the next question, we do have time for a few more questions, but we are rapidly approaching the end of our time together. So if you've been watching and holding back a question, now's the time to drop it into the chat box, and we will get to as many of them as possible before we have to say goodbye today. So with that said, we're going to go into Willa's question next. Willa is asking if you have any tips, Nicki, for sewing spandex.
Yes. So spandex can be tricky because you're sewing something, and when you choose spandex, it's because you want it to fit tightly to your body. So if you're sewing a bodysuit, dance wear, whatever, when you're sewing spandex, first and foremost, you want to make sure you're using a stretch needle. So this one says stretch on it, so that would be a good one for sewing spandex or knit or any other type of stretchy material. A ballpoint needle or a jersey needle will also work because all of those are designed for knit and stretchy fabrics. And the difference is, instead of having a really sharp tip on the end of that needle, it is slightly rounded, so that instead of potentially cutting through the fibers of that knit fabric, that slightly rounded tip kind of nestles in between, and that helps prevent getting runs in the fabric. It helps preserve the life of the garment because the seams get put under a bit of stress when you're sewing something that needs to stretch over your body. So use one of those, either a stretch or a ballpoint or a jersey needle. Make sure you're using all-purpose or polyester thread, not 100% cotton thread. That has absolutely no give at all. And even though you're going to be using stitches that are stretch stitches that build in stretch to the seam, sometimes you stretch that seam to the end of the stretch that you've built in with your stitch, and you want just a little bit of extra wiggle room, a little bit of give, so that you don't pop a stitch in that seam. So polyester thread or all-purpose thread, which is a polyester core cotton wrapped thread, will give you just that little tiny bit of give. It doesn't stretch like a stretch, like elastic or anything, but it just gives you that little bit of wiggle room to make sure you don't pop any stitches. And do make sure you use your stretch stitches. So that's a zigzag stitch or a triple stitch, which is 2 stitches forward and 1 stitch back. On my machine, that stitch looks like just a very thick straight stitch because it's 2 forward and 1 back. So it's that back stitch, when you stretch that seam, that back stitch kind of can, pull out, and it's like a very tight zigzag almost. I also have a stretch zigzag stitch, which instead of going like this, the zigzag, it goes kind of like lightning bolt. So it builds in a little bit more room into that stitch. So zigzag, stretch stitch, triple stretch, stretch zigzag stitch. If you have any other stitch on your machine that has an out and an in, that's going to build stretch into your seam. If you have a serger, that's pretty great for sewing stretch things because serged seams have a lot of stretch built in. So make sure you're building in enough stretch into your seams. And a lot of spandex material can be very slinky and kind of like liquidy. So use a lot of pins to keep your layers together. Maybe even use a walking foot or engage your dual feed foot like I have on my FOF to make sure the layers stay together and don't, slip and slide. So best of luck.
All right, staying on fabric for this next comment here, viewer Lori, to go back to when we were talking about making your garments look finished and polished. So Lori says that she thinks making clothes look polished is about fabric choice. So, Nicki, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about certain fabrics and maybe what you would use as a go-to for an elevated garment piece.
Yes. So fabric choice is super important. And that is where you can't really skimp on cost because a cheaper fabric, a lot of times you're going to be able to tell it's going to not drape as well, probably. And for garments, I really like rayon. That's my favorite. That's what my shirt is made out of. It has a really nice flowy feel while also still being fairly stable. Um, so rayon is great. Lyocell is kind of it's starting to gain more traction. It's very similar to rayon. It's just more wrinkle resistant and it's more eco friendly. So Lyocell is awesome. Tencel is the brand name for Lyocell, or a brand name of Lyocell. So if you see Tencel, it's kind of expensive, but I think it's worth it. I actually the pants I'm wearing right now are made of Lyocell, and I they're so comfortable and they're it's a very strong fabric. So I wear them all the time. I'm gonna get so much life out of the pants. So that is highly recommended. Um, so yeah, fabric choice is very important. It depends on what type of garment you're making. So if you're making like a crisp button down blouse, just like a plain woven cotton fabric will do just fine. But for like a flowy garment, like a dress or a boxier top, rayon or lyocell is fantastic. So, and I know it's hard, maybe hard to get into a store, but if you can look at the fabric, get your hands on the fabric, that's always that's always preferable. That's always ideal rather than buying online because you just can't really get a feel for the hand of it. So if you can, and don't feel bad about unwinding fabric from the bolt and like draping it over your neck, the people in the fabric store will understand. You got to get a feel for the hand of it.
Okay, I think we have time to get to these next three questions. Might be able to sneak in a fourth. So let's start with Bonnie's. Bonnie is asking, when I sew on knit or t-shirt fabric, it sometimes wobbles or waves, I would say, at the hem. Do I need to change my tension or my stitch length?
So, Bonnie, that is a super frequent question that I get, and it was a very common problem for people when they're sewing on knits. So, because the knit kind of stretches sometimes when it's going under the presser foot, it stretches as you're laying the seam down. Your zigzag stitch or your whatever stitch you're using at the hem, and a lot of times it'll happen on necklines too. So to prevent your fabric from stretching out as it's going under the presser foot, you can do a couple of things. You can decrease the presser foot pressure. If your machine allows you to do that, you can check your manual. Sometimes it doesn't, but my Fa Passport has a little knob up here. I can twist one way or the other. There's a plus or a minus. Plus means when that presser foot goes down onto the throat plate of the machine, it sits fairly hard. So a lot of times I will twist that knob to the minus so that when it presses down on the fabric, it's not smashing down so hard. It's just gently holding the fabric down. And that's going to help prevent your fabric from stretching out as it's going under the foot. You can also you can use a walking foot or a roller foot if you have one of those. But the thing that I find works super great and it's super easy and simple is putting a layer of tissue paper under your fabric, under your seam. And that tissue paper it acts kind of like a stabilizer. It just stabilizes the fabric enough so that it's not stretching out. And then once you lay your seam down, you tear that tissue paper away and you're left with a nice stable seam. And you can use the tissue paper that comes in your gift bags at Christmas, or you can save the clippings from your patterns because a lot of commercial patterns are printed on that really fine tissue paper. And as you cut your patterns out, there's a lot extra in the corners. Just save that, put it under your seams when you're stitching, and I find a huge help. And then if you still get some wobble, you can take it to your iron, give it a little steam press, and a lot of times those wrinkles will kind of disappear and things will go back to their normal shape. So a couple things you can try.
All right, let's go to Amanda's question next. Amanda says, sometimes when I'm sewing a lightning stitch to sew double brushed poly, the stitch will sew as a straight stitch instead of the zigzag. What can I do to fix this? I'm using a new ballpoint needle.
Yes, so that has happened to me sometimes as well. I'm trying to stitch a zigzag stitch, or as you call it, a lightning stitch, the ziggy zaggy stitch. It'll miss the out part of the stitch and just go to the straight part of the stitch. So a couple things might be happening. It could be a tension issue. So you might need to loosen up your tension, and so you're using a new ballpoint needle. That would have been my next tip, was to try a fresh needle on your machine, because a lot of times when your needle's getting dull, it will skip stitches and it will just act funny. So that's good. You have a new ballpoint needle. So you can try messing with your tension a little bit. You can try changing your thread. Sometimes if your thread is a little bit too heavy for either your needle or for your fabric, just the marriage of all of those components will make things be a little bit screwy. So you can try using a lighter all-purpose thread, something that is a little less lofty. You can try helping that fabric go under the presser foot a little bit easier. Sometimes if it's a little bit bulky under the presser foot, it has trouble laying down all the stitches that it needs to. So if you have a foot that can help things go under the needle, I've said walking foot a couple of times now, but it is a super helpful tool to help things slide under the presser foot really easy. So yeah, you can give those things a try. You can try also cleaning your machine out of like lint and dust. Sometimes if lint and dust gets built up in your machine, it can affect your machine in weird ways. And a lot of times it comes out in tension problems. So you can take your throat plate off, and most machines come with a little lint brush. Swizzle that around, get all the lint out. You can take a piece of stable cotton fabric, fold it in half, and floss out your tension discs. So open up your tension discs so that there's no tension, so that the discs are as far apart as they go, and floss that out. And sometimes that'll just get out enough lint and dust that the thread will be able to run through your machine nice and smooth. There will be no extra stuff putting more tension on the thread, and it just helps lay down a nice seam without any tension issues. So you can try a couple of those things, and hopefully that'll alleviate that problem.
Okay, let's go to Gail's question next here. Gail wants to know where there is a good place online to order patterns.
Yeah, that's becoming a much bigger thing, is getting your patterns online. So you can do a couple different ways. So you can buy your patterns and order them online and get a physical pattern sent to you, or you can buy your digital pattern. I know Berta Style does that a lot. They have digital PDFs for patterns. I have gotten patterns from Mood Fabrics. They have a lot of actually free patterns too, free PDF downloads for your patterns. But really, it depends on what specific pattern you're looking for. That's how I do my pattern shopping a lot of times, is V-neck dress pattern. that's my Google search term. And then I shop around a little bit, see what style I like. So like I said, Berta style, mood fabrics. Uh, I'm going to Google it really quick. Liesel Gibson. I don't know if that was, Simple Simon. That's what I'm thinking of. Simple Simon has a lot of great patterns, and they have a blog that is super great for sewing. Simple Simon and Company. They have a lot of fun patterns for kids as well. So it depends on what you're looking for, but the internet is a wonderful and sometimes overwhelming place, but it takes a little bit of research to find exactly what you're looking for. But those PDF patterns are getting to be a big way that patterns are distributed, and the good pattern companies will have a lot of times it's a 1-inch square on the pattern, so that when you print it out, you can measure it and make sure you printed it in the right, the right scale. And they'll have crosshairs in the corners so that you can line them up and tape them together and make sure everything is the right size. So you can look for that on the patterns, and that makes it a lot easier to get your PDF patterns correct.
Okay, let's finish with Lucy's question. Now, I'm not sure if this is possible for you, Nicki. I'm not sure what your setup is, but Lucy's curious about, you mentioned that your pants are made of the lyocell fabric, and is wondering if you're able to stand up so they can see the pattern or style that works well with that fabric. And I guess if not, could you describe them and talk a little bit about how that works?
Yes, let me see if you can see them. This is a pattern that I made. So let me stand on my chair. So it's like I have my knit at the bottom there. This is actually, I did this as a class for National Sewing Circle as well. So it's making lounge pants or something. You can look on nationalsewingcircle.com. But it's great for a style of pants that's a little bit looser and comfy. So the lyocell, it's almost heavy, kind of. It has a heavy drape, but it's also very lightweight and airy and flowy. So, and it was, fairly easy to work with too. It wasn't too bad. But this is my little bit more of a loose fit lounge pant is great for that fabric.
All right, so we got a little bit of sewing skills and a little bit of balancing on chair skills today. All right, well, that does bring us to the end of our time for today's Q&A. So, Nicki, before we say goodbye, I always like to give our experts a little last-minute floor to say any final thoughts or anything that has crossed your mind that no one has asked a question about yet.
Well, I always like to tell people who are wanting to get back into sewing or wanting to learn to sew for the first time to start small, start with small projects, straight seams, straight lines, and like I mentioned before, splurge on your fabric. If there's a fabric that you absolutely adore, get it. But don't start, if you're just starting to sew, don't jump right into rayon or lyocell or knit fabrics. Start with something a little bit more stable, like a quilting cotton. But there's a ton of fun stuff you can do with that quilting cotton fabric: scarves, bags, pillowcases, things that are straight lines, straight seams, really easy, but in a fabric that makes you smile and it makes you want to come back to sewing and do more and learn more. And just adding to your skills a little bit at a time, instead of trying to jump right into making a pair of pants or something right at the get-go. Starting small is going to help avoid frustration and make you want to come back and do more.
All right, well, with that said, I have to say thank you to Nicki for answering all of the questions today. Thank you to all of you for viewing. I do want to remind you, if you haven't already, you can click the link in the description, and there's a PDF for color theory that you can have available for download. If you didn't do that already and are interested, go ahead and grab that. come back and revisit this live Q&A anytime in the future if you would like, and definitely join us for our future Q&As as well. So on behalf of Nicki, the National Sewing Circle, and everybody on the team behind the scenes, my name is Leah. Thank you for joining us, and until we see you next time, happy sewing.